So we have these paintings, but we also have pieces of prose and poetry, and we have what I call red notes. So, and what surprised me that I can read this book just by painting, and I will get a story. I can read this book just by pieces of poetry and prose, and I will get the story. And I can read this book just by red notes, and I will have a book about creative process, about how to be a writer. So here's like have 4 layers of structure, and we have book inside of the book. But what is more fascinating that I can read this book from different places. For example, I can read this book from the end to the beginning. And usually when we read book like this, it becomes not interesting because like we have all answers in the end of at the end of the book. So that's why usually we read it page by page from the beginning to the end. That's what helps us to keep the story. But this book, no matter how I read it, it keeps the story. It's like these 4 layers. They're not just layers of plot, but it also like different directions how I can read this book. And it's I've never seen nothing like that. I mean, no matter how I read this book, it keeps the story. So my first question, Jack, how did you create that structure? How do you work with structure, and what helped you to create such an amazing structure? It's so unique that no matter how we read it, we always get the story.
Wow, that is such a big question. And when you say the red notes, for those of you that have the book, sometime when you see a painting in a museum, it will tell you when it was created and the size of it. And sometimes there might be a little sentence or two from the painter, and they call that signage. But I put the signage next to each painting in red, and Natalie calls it red notes, which I kind of like. That's a really big question because it goes to the question of structure and form and linear story. And when I really think about it, something occurs to me that we were talking about the other day. See, there you have a painting of a character, and you notice there's a lot of words in the painting. So when Natalie says there's 4 layers, there's really 5, because you could just read through the book, just reading the text of the words in the painting as a separate linear form. Although sometimes the words are really graphically part of the painting and not necessarily text, because there's one of the first paintings in the book, the text is a letter. It's called something missile, a letter, but it's all smudged by the watercolor. So you can't really read it. So the question becomes, are those words text to be separate from the painting, or are they actually part of the design of the painting, and they're not meant to be looked at as words, but just as smudges? So it's actually a 5-ring circus, which is my metaphor, because the text can be separate from the paintings, and then of course they are part of the painting. So now we have 5 layers. But your question about the structure, it goes all the way back to when I was about 11 years old, believe it or not, when I started writing and decided I was going to be a writer. And my father was a Marxist, and I learned that very early, and he had books in his library. And once you start reading, I started reading Das Kapital, which is full of poetry. He even has a review of a poet named Martin Tupper. He excoriates him in a great passage. It's really great. But once you start reading Marx, you go back to Kant and you go back to Hegel. And Hegel was the big influence on me, even when I was 11 and 12 years old and started writing. Because Hegel's idea about the thesis, the antithesis, and then the synthesis becomes something new. So the thesis and the antithesis are opposites, but then when you meld them, it becomes something else. So even when I was 11 and 12, I used to print my little stories, and sometime I would draw a picture with it, and I'd mix it up, and then I would staple it, and I'd bring it to school, and some of the kids would read it. And so I was always playing with the form and the structure, even when I was 11 and 12 years old, with the idea that I could be opposite of whatever I was doing, because the opposite would meld with its opposite. And my dad, who was an alcoholic and drank a lot, the way for me to get over that in school and not be anxious and worried that, because I loved my father, he was a great man, I always worried that he would drive and get killed. And that was my fear. And so when I went to school, I was very anxious. I think until the fourth grade, I didn't pay attention. I don't think I heard anything. But the way I overcame that was with comedy, by being the class clown. And yet inside, the old Pagliacci thing, inside I was either crying or I was aware of life's deeper meanings, because a lot of my friends, and I watched Father Knows Best, I thought every family was happy except mine, or, sane instead of crazy. And so comedy overcame that, but inside I was already reading stuff and I was thinking. So the structure of exit music is something that I've been working toward in an underground way, I think, all my life. When I started making little books as a kid, then my father bought me a typewriter. Oh God, the things I could do with a typewriter. I put pages in upside down. I put them in sideways. Then I would fold them and staple. I'd make little chapbooks out of them. So the structure is something that gradually grew. And a lot of my books I approach structurally because, again, I know I tell everybody go to Ralph's to get a chicken, don't know what you're going to do. But sometimes, in a Hegelian sense, you can see an end product, the book, and you could be creative working toward the book. So I've always had that notion. And sometimes it would occur to me, I'm going to make a book that's going to be small. And so this book, All the Sad Angels, if I put it up against my face, as you can see, it's much bigger than a normal book. And I thought, I'll do something small. And the idea of a circus came to me. So a lot of the poems, All the Sad Angels, have the motif of a circus and the sad angel, not the happy angel, but the sad angel. Then one day, I don't know what, I thought, I want to make a book that's tiny, like a flip book. Remember when you were a kid, you had a flip book and you'd flip it and it would be like Mickey Mouse doing something? Well, I thought, okay, I'm going to make a book that's really small. See this book here? See how thick it is? I didn't intend it to be that thick. I thought it was going to be about, I don't know, maybe that thick. But of course, once you start getting creative, things get out of hand. So I made a little book and I thought, well, what can I write for that book? Haiku. I'll write haiku. So I wrote a book of, I was going to only make 25 haiku, but it ended up being 50 of them. And I put 2 on each page. And then I decided to write an introduction. And I thought, I wrote haiku when I was in 3rd grade. And then when I thought I would be a writer, I thought, I'm not going to do haiku. That's for kids. I'm not going to do haiku anymore. I didn't do haiku for 60 years. And then I started to do a book called, haiku. And I opened up with an essay called A Windswept Spirit. And it was supposed to be just maybe, 2 or 3 pages. And it had a lot of little chapters in it. Let me show you how thick the opening essay is. That thick. 350 pages. And I actually counted the paragraphs, and the chapters are very short. So it's 201 chapters, 301 haiku, 201 chapters, and 601 paragraphs. And then finally one day, I was thinking about a deck of cards. And I thought, I'm going to experiment with form. And I'm going to write something that's the size of a deck of cards, but it's a little bigger, as you can see. And I started experimenting not just with the way they are in a box. I mean, they're separate cards, but look at all those letters, by the way, this is done way before, Adobe and Photoshop. Those are hand-drawn letters. And every page had a constellation of letters. Some of them would be upside down, and you'd have to read it this way, you'd have to read it that way. And there were 52 of them in a box. So sometimes the image of a finished form, and then you go to Ralph's to get a chicken and it grows into that, the structure can have all sorts of manifold expressions, and it can be really, really creative and really, really interesting. And one last word about structure, classical structure. Natalie, you mentioned the 3-act form, and that's what they tend to teach in screenwriting and stuff. But I want to remind you that there are more than 3-act forms. There's a 5-act form and there's a 2-act form. And the 2-act form is really unique. There's a movie now playing that I think Bill Nighy is nominated for Best Actor called Living. It's based on a movie that Akira Kurosawa did in 1949, a few years after the Second World War. And that movie is called Ikiru. I highly recommend you watch this movie. It's in black and white. Ikiru, Ikiru. That's the name of the main character, the one that Bill Nighy plays in the modern British version. It's got a 2-act form, and the 2nd act is revolutionary in how it is done. So not only do you have the 2-act form, you've got the 2nd act, which is kind of inverted within itself. It is a great film, one of Kurosawa's great films. Look at that one first, then see the Bill Nighy one, which is also in the 2-act form, but they treat it a little differently. So there's a show on TV right now called Poker Face with Leone, Natasha Leone something. It has a 2-act form, but done in a different way. The first half, they show you everything that happens and you think she's not there. Then the second half, they repeat the first half, but now she's there and she's observing everything that goes on and she's going to solve the murder. So that's a 2-act form. So the 3-act form is, not the only one. So when I did exit music, I realized it's really got 5 different structural parts, and I saw it as a hologram. Now, I don't know if any of you know the principle of the hologram, but if you can imagine it in a 2-dimensional negative that you would have for a photograph, the negative of a regular photograph, you hold it up and you see the photograph. If I cut a piece of that photograph out, I'm only going to see that piece. So if I cut the part out that has my eye, I'm just going to see my eye. But that's not how a holograph works. A holograph negative, every part of the negative contains the whole negative. So if I get a 3-hole punch and I punch a hole out of the negative of a hologram, that little circle is the whole picture, but from that point of view. So if I cut the hole from the bottom of the negative, I'm looking up at the picture. If I cut it from the middle of the negative, I'm looking straight ahead at the whole picture. And if I cut a little hole out of the top, I'm going to see that picture from the top view. So exit music is like a hologram. And that's why, Natalie, whether you read it straight through just the poems, straight through just looking at the pictures, straight through just looking at the text in the pictures, straight through just reading the red notes, or you read the whole thing straight through, every page has got all 5 levels on it, you're still going to get something. And to add to that, Natalie, as you said, if you read it backwards, it works as well. Because one summer when I was 16, I got bored with just reading one book after another. I read a lot of books. I decided one summer, how many books can I read at one time? And I ended up with 7 books. I would read one chapter from one from another, one from another. Then I go chapter 2, chapter 2. eventually, as I was doing that, I thought this isn't challenging enough. And I got an 8th book that I decided to read backwards. It was a nonfiction book by Paul de Groot, who's a science writer, called Microbe Hunters, all about the scientists and their microscopes and things like that. So while I was reading 7 books forward simultaneously, I was reading this book backwards, 1 page at a time. So the whole holographic sense of exit music comes from my experience in all of that from the time I was 11 years old.
But why it's not like it's not like a chaos? Because we have a lot of books that looks like that, but when you read it, it's like broken pieces. They don't hold the story. So why here is like we still have the story, and it's not like a chaos.
I think because it's intentional.
It's like the hologram. If you cut a piece of it at the bottom, you'll still get the whole story, but from that point of view. And the other thing is, I've been doing that all my life. If I just have a normal book of poetry, I put the poems together in a way in which many themes, and this works with exit music, many themes work themselves through so that at the end of the book, all the themes come together. It's just more complicated with exit music because I've got paintings, signage, text in the paintings, poems, and the essays. But I've been doing that so long, I can do it. I can just do it. It's second nature to me.